team will inform you when to stand. Please remain at your seats until the chair and witnesses have left the room. Thank you for your attention. The hearing will start in a few moments.
Now, good morning, Mr. Turner.
Good morning, my lord.
Now you have a witness for us.
I do indeed. The first witness today is Mr. Stephen Montgomery from the Scottish Hospitality Group.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Montgomery.
Good morning, my lord.
Right, I'm sure Mr. Turner's got some questions for you, so we'll just start. Mr. Turner?
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Mr. Montgomery.
Good morning.
Before I begin, could I just remind you that today's hearing will be transcribed. The stenographer's not in the room, but we need to remember to try and speak slowly and clearly. It's something I often forget, so please don't follow me, but if you could, that will help us. Could you please state your full name?
Yeah, Stephen Frederick Montgomery.
And you've provided a response to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry, is that correct?
That's correct.
And for the record, that is SCI SHG XXX 17, my lord. Mr. Montgomery, we're going to talk about some of the matters that you've raised in that Rule 8 response. I should say that you've provided a number of documents to the inquiry. Those and that Rule 8 response will be taken fully into account by His Lordship, even if we don't touch upon matters today. You're here today representing the Scottish Hospitality Group, is that correct?
That's correct.
We'll come on to discuss the group itself in a moment, but if I could first please ask some questions about your own position.
Yes.
What is your title and role within the group?
Now formally as Director and Spokesperson from the Scottish Hospitality Group.
And how long have you held that position?
We have been on the go since probably July, August of 2020, although we didn't formalise properly until probably October of 2023.
Thank you. And it's implicit, I think, from what you said there, that the group was not in existence at the beginning of the pandemic. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could you tell me what role you were holding at the time of the beginning of the pandemic?
When the pandemic struck in March 2020, whenever we got into lockdown, I was at another trade body, Scottish Licensed Trade Association, and then I left there in the June, July, and then was approached by someone else to give a voice to others.
Thank you. Those roles, both I think you said the president of the Scottish Licensed Trade Association and the director and spokesman, are those full-time positions?
No, they were both voluntary at that time.
Thank you. And do you have, therefore, other work interests?
Yes, whenever the pandemic struck, I had 3 businesses, all in hospitality, a hotel in Lockerbie, a bar restaurant in Lockerbie, and also a bar and restaurant in Dumfries.
Thank you. Again, we'll come on to talk about the hospitality group in a moment, but if I could just ask you briefly about the period at the start of the pandemic. So you were representing the Scottish Licensed Trade Association, SLTA, at that time. Did you have any pandemic-specific involvement on behalf of the SLTA?
I think it was just attending meetings for government. I think at that time when lockdown happened, being in a hotel of my own and nothing else to do with myself, I took the job of making sure that we had a voice, if you like, within government, and any meeting that we could attend, I was able to do that, because it was imperative. I think that information that was given was passed out as wide as possible, and again, the members were the immediate thought.
Thank you. And when did your presidency end of the SLTA?
June, July of 2020.
And did your involvement with the groups that you were discussing there in terms of liaising, so did that continue after the end of your presidency?
Yes, it did.
I'm going to ask you now some questions about the formation of the Scottish Hospitality Group. You've mentioned when it was formed. Can you tell me why?
I was approached by a colleague who has a trade magazine, and she had noticed what I'd been doing across social media and getting information distributed, and was aware of the fact that I'd left SLTA. She said that there was some people who felt that they didn't have a voice, although they were members of other associations, and asked would I have a chat with them. And I was like, who was this? Who were these people? And once you started to name up the people, like companies like Buzzworks, Signature Group, etc., who are probably Scotland's most well-known, largest family-operated hospitality businesses, I felt a wee bit nervy, because we were small pie in comparison to what they were. But I joined a couple of calls with them, and felt that it was a good fit for what I wanted to do. And then we came up with the name after about 2 or 3 calls of the Scottish Hospitality Group, and it formed from there.
And you mentioned a couple of names there. These people that you're talking about, that's who formed the group?
Yeah,
ultimately?
They were initially the 6 or 7 large family businesses that formed the group. Most of them now still sit on our steering group, our board. And they came to me with their issues. I continued to meet with government. And we met twice a week online, so that information could be passed on, or any issues that they had could be passed to me. Bearing in mind that it may well have been only 6 or 7 people. However, the amount of venues and units that these people had equated to over 250, 300 units. So it was a large population of people, and that was a lot of staff as well.
Thank you. And you mentioned these were well-known family-run hospitality businesses. Do I take it from that these are operators that you were talking to?
Yes. One thing about our group is everybody that's a member, including myself, we all operate our own businesses. So we have that unique selling point, if you like, that we are taking anything that we have as an issue, as a problem, from our own experiences.
Thank you. You mentioned, in terms of the genesis of the organisation, it started off on a sort of informal basis, and it's now moved to a formal organisation. What is the current status of the organisation?
The current status of the organisation is we formed ourselves legally and properly with the Companies House in 2023, October 2023. We had our first members' lunch in Glasgow in 2023, and since then we have formed a membership. It's paid membership, which is formed by, depending on turnover, depends on the membership costs. And we also have another income from our supplier partners. So that would be bigger, some of the people within hospitality, suppliers, wholesalers, etc. And they pay an annual fee to sponsor or to be your supplier partner.
Thank you. Again, it's implicit from what you've said that the organisation started during COVID, but it's continued after COVID, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, and I think that's because we seen that there was a need for that voice, And after COVID started to fade away, we kind of got together online and said, what's next? What are the issues? Are we done? And to everyone, to a man, all said the same. There's things like deposit return scheme coming down. We have the alcohol advertising coming on, single-use plastics, tourism levy, all these things happening. And because we had such a good voice and such a good relationship with the Scottish Government and the UK Government, that we need to continue.
Thank you. And you mentioned obviously there's now subscriptions, etc. Does your membership has it continued through the piece? Does it remain the same kind of people that are members of the SHG?
No, we have our membership has grown vastly since our incorporation. Now we probably represent probably over 700 odd units across Scotland. There's an employment base of probably in around the same 7,000, 6,500, 7,000, and a turnover of probably between 650 and 700 million is a grand turnover.
Thank you. If we could have page 1 of the Rule 8 response. On that, Mr Montgomery, you've kindly set out the aims of the organisation. Those are to promote the sector as a professional place to work, to be the forward-thinking voice of hospitality in Scotland, to input, advise and be a sounding board for governments and officials where required, to work with governments both in Scotland and Westminster for the betterment of the sector, to help and advise our members and the wider hospitality sector in areas they need assistance with, and to promote hospitality in a positive way. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I wasn't going to test your memory there, Mr Montgomery. If I could now turn to the role of the group during the pandemic. You've mentioned your own personal involvement on behalf of the SLTA and then after the presidency ended. Did your involvement continue when the hospitality group came into being?
Yes, and that has continued up to today as well. Any meeting at all that government were having that hospitality had to be involved in, or any meeting with government officials, we were involved in that, and I think that came from the relationship that I'd built up previously in a previous role.
And what form did those meetings take?
All meetings were done online, via Teams or in that relation.
And who was participating in them?
It'd either be myself and some of the Cabinet Secretaries, whether it be Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes, who was Cabinet Secretary for Finance at the time, or Fergus Ewing, or some of that, Fiona Heslop sometimes, as well as other government officials who would have been heading up the tourism policy at that time, and still is today. And there would also have been other people from other trade associations, not just licensed trade associations. It could have been Scottish Tourism Alliance, Association Self Catering, etc. There would have been, depending on what the meeting was about, would have depended on who was actually on that call.
And how many, very roughly, how many people were attending these kinds of meetings?
There's some times where there was maybe 70, 80 people on the call, which in my own personal view I think was far, far too many.
And what sort of matters were being discussed? We'll come on to talk so very broadly what sort of matters were being discussed.
I think there was a broad range of matters. It was mainly about what was the government's thinking at the time. And I think in looking back now, it was about what they were wanting to do. And I think we all know and realise that we're living in times, unprecedented times, where nobody knew what was going to happen. So you're taking the role of the government as being the true word, although from our point of view, possibly some of the policies and some of the areas that they were looking at were probably too hard in some ways for us.
Sorry, too hard? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll come on to it later on, but some things like the music ban and things like that there, that you kind of wondered why they were there, given the fact that, background music and hospitality isn't about people up shouting and singing, especially in a restaurant. It's trying to bring atmosphere and divide conversations between table to table more than anything else.
Thank you. Did you find those meetings useful? Did you gain any knowledge from them?
That's kind of a hard question to answer. Some of it possibly yes, because you were gaining information, but some of it, because of the amount of people who were on the call, didn't really relate to to hospitality. You were maybe some things regarding bed and breakfast, for example, that had no impact on what we were talking about in licensed hospitality. So some of the information just really wasn't worth it.
Okay. So we've talked about those meetings and the calls. Did you have any other lines of communication with government?
We would have had lines of communication with some of the cabinet secretaries at the time. That would normally have been within the 4 or 5 trade bodies, hospitality trade bodies that we had going at that time, where we would have had conversations with, as I said, Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes or Fergus Ewing. And I'd have to say that I would say that looking back now, they would have a better understanding of hospitality during the pandemic as what they had previously to it. So those would have been our main points of contact.
Do you feel, from what you've said there, that you were educating them? You're saying that they had a better knowledge after or during than before.
I think it's a continual job, trying to educate ministers and the government on the model and the rules around hospitality and how we operate. I think that'll take a long time to get through. But during the pandemic, I think it would be fair to say that we were frustrated at a lot of the things that were going on. Some of the policies were being put in place, which led to that education. I think once the pandemic struck and businesses were shut down and we were having these meetings, I would like to think that ministers were of the opinion that when they were looking from the outside previously to hospitality, before the pandemic, into hospitality, they thought we were a busy sector. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, where bars and restaurants, hotels were full. But actually, when they were inside the room during lockdown and looking out, they realised that actually probably hospitality wasn't in the best position even before the pandemic, and the pandemic just actually made it worse.
We're talking obviously just now, Mr. Montgomery, about the role of the hospitality group. You've told us about the input you were having in terms of lines of communication with government. Did you receive any output from them in respect of the information you were getting from these lines of communication? Was information coming to you as the hospitality group?
Information was coming to us on some of the policy that were being imposed. However, a lot of that information was very last minute, which didn't really help anybody at all, not just our members or the wider hospitality businesses in the sector, but certainly for the consumer as well. Last minute decisions weren't what we wanted. And I'm ex-army, and it was always, plan, prepare and execute. Where in a lot of the cases we found during the pandemic, it was actually execute and then let everybody else plan and prepare for it.
And once they had executed, as it were, what did the hospitality group do with that information? Were you assisting your members over the piece?
We, as well as our twice weekly meetings on Zoom or on Teams, we distributed all the information we were getting through guidance, through our email channels, through our Facebook channels, through any social media channels we can, and that wasn't for our own membership. It was for the wider hospitality sector as well, because at that time we weren't really considering ourselves as being just closed group, because it was essential that information went to as wide a population as ever, whether that be across Twitter, what's now known as X, or whether it be Facebook, whatever the case was, everybody was seeing that, so it was the consumers and people who had hospitality businesses.
Thank you. And in terms of that information, what kinds of information were you providing to your members?
If a policy is coming out around guidance, whether that be the 1 metre social distancing, or whether it be the distance between tables, or whether vertical drinking, music bans, drinking outside but not inside, shutting at 6 o'clock but you could drink outside at 10 o'clock. I mean, even at that short 5 sentences is quite confusing. So if we were being confused about it, how does the consumer feel? So, because we were getting to the point where consumers are coming in actually not knowing what they were allowed to do as well, and our teams were having to face that head on and explain to them, listen, this is what's being set by government and this is what we have to abide by.
You're you're fair to say that some of that's confusing. Perhaps I could just pick up one term, because it's not one that I'm particularly familiar with, vertical drinking. Could you explain that term?
Yeah, so vertical drinking came about where if you were sat down at a table, you could have a drink, but if you're standing up, you couldn't. You weren't allowed to stand at the bar and have a drink. So it was all seated service. And then we went on to the other parts where later on in the pandemic where if you were sat down at a table, you could take your face covering off, but if you stood up to go to the toilet or whatever, you had to put your face covering on. But where it got confusing was once drinking came back inside or hospitality venues, if you had a drink in your hand, obviously you couldn't have a face covering on. So what people were then starting to do was actually walk into the toilet just with a glass in their hand or having a drink, because that were you allowed to have a drink and you didn't have to wear a mask. It was just so confusing at times.
We're going to come on and talk about financial matters specifically in a moment, but just again in terms of the group's role, did you have any involvement with financial assistance that was available to the sector?
Yes, in I think it was December 2020 or December 2021, I'm not quite sure which one it was, we had been given, I had a conversation with the Cabinet Secretary, Kate Forbes, on around grants. For example, whenever lockdowns came in, and it was about a 90 million, 100 million pound grant that was being made available. Myself and the other trade bodies were tasked with trying to look at what best way to divide that up, and that's only one of the instances. We spent quite a lot of time trying to decide who was best to get that money, because at that time anybody over a £51,000 rateable value, which is probably one of the ways that grants were given out right the way through the pandemic, was done in rateable values. Those with a rateable value over 51,000 were actually receiving little or nothing at the time. So we spent a lot of time, as I said, trying to work out what way we divide that money up. We felt at that time that cafes shouldn't be given any grant funding at that time, because they were remaining open, because we had the row about what was a cafe, etc. So they were allowed to stay open, so they were making money, if you like, or maybe not making money, but they were still in operation. We presented that to government, it was all agreed, and then because of the way that the grants were given out through the rateable system, they found more money and dished it out to cafes as well. Had we have known that there was more money available, we'd have changed our model a wee bit. One of the other issues that we had was, personally from myself, was trying to get grants out to people, how that was done, because on many occasions we had relationships with COSLA and discussions with them. Because of the rateable value system and the many people who took over pubs and restaurants, etc., their updated information weren't on the Scottish Assessors roll. So when they were applying for grants as being the people involved in that business, their names weren't on the Assessor's roll. It was maybe the previous occupier or even the landlord. So many times those grants were denied. So it was a real hard task to speak to COSLA and to get this sorted out.
And did the hospitality group, did it offer any assistance to its members in those regards?
Absolutely, I was the point of contact right the way through that, and it was like a three-way dialogue between myself, our member, or even not members at that time, anybody that knew we had contacts coming into me, and then we would take all the information and then go back to COSLA to try and sort out the issues. And I have to say that COSLA on many occasions were very, very good at that, but there wasn't just us, it was retail, it was everybody else doing the exact same thing, I'm sure.
And you've mentioned there helping people who weren't members of the group. Did you find that other businesses were approaching you for assistance?
Absolutely. I think given the profile that we created since our formation and previously to that in my previous role, because every day, to all hours of the night, it was on social media, whatever the case was, to try and get the word out, so that anybody at that time who were looking for information, it didn't matter where they got it from, they just wanted that information, my lord, and I think we were that point of contact. And again, I was more than happy to do that because I was sitting doing nothing anyway, so it was to keep my own mind going as well, so from a personal point of view.
And in terms of the ability to access that information, were there other people providing it at the same time, or were you the main contact for these kinds of organisations?
From an SHG point of view, absolutely. I was the only point of contact because apart from our board, who are busy doing their own day-to-day, running their own businesses, large businesses, I'm the only person that's in the office, I feel like, and that's my own office and my own business. So it was quite a big job, but one that I took on board, and one, thankfully, that we were able to digest across to everybody.
And in terms of other organisations, we obviously know that you are president of the SLTA. Were there other organisations providing assistance to the hospitality industry?
Yes, you would have had UK Hospitality Scotland, the Nighttime Industries Association, Scottish Beer and Pub would have also been there.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you now more specifically about rules and guidance. You've touched upon a number of matters we've been discussing this morning. One of the things you mentioned was the question of timing. Mm-hmm. Are you able to elaborate on the issue of timing of the issue of guidance?
Yeah, we had one instance in particular where the 16th of December in 2021, where we had the news release or a media release from Public Health Scotland around Omicron. Normally you would have had an update from Scottish Government, whether it be the First Minister at 12:20 in the afternoon, or whether it be through our meetings with Government. We would have had an insight as to the state of where COVID was, and this is the things that's happening. However, 16th of December there was published guidance on Omicron, and it came into effect on the 17th of December at midnight. That's far too short notice, my lord, especially whenever we're looking at, especially at that time, when in 2020 Christmas, we had that Cinderella Christmas where everybody had to be home by midnight, basically, and because after that, we were locked down again. Everybody was looking forward to a really good Christmas in 2021. Things were looking good. Bearing in mind, hospitality plan for Christmas, September, at the latest, start into October. So suppliers and wholesalers were certainly not taking the risk. They were asking for money up front for whether it be simple things like Brussels sprouts, turkeys, all those kinds of stuff. All that was ordered, etc. Public Health Scotland came out and said, don't go to hospitality venues, etc., because Omicron is spreading, etc. We seen an absolute tsunami of cancellations overnight. That was even before Scottish Government came out and told us the exact same as what Public Health Scotland had said. So from our own group at that time, we estimated the loss of about £10 million for the month of December. And that was simply because we were having to close venues, people were cancelling bookings, etc., etc. So last minute policy was no good, and we've always been of the belief that rush policy is bad policy, and that was just one of those. Same again with the music ban. That was last minute. We were given 2 days notice as of, I think it was a Thursday, and then of a Saturday morning, there was no music to be allowed in bars and restaurants. So that time to be able to train staff, put in things like, dividers for tables, rearrange restaurants, table service, etc. The train staff, etc. was just too short notice. And we obviously understand that COVID was a moving beast. However, that plan, prepare before you execute, there was very little of that.
You've mentioned there a couple of examples. Did you find that sort of last-minute approach was unusual, or was that something that you recognised as being the norm in terms of the timing of these kinds of announcements?
Yeah, I think it became the norm, and you were trying to second judge it ahead of it, to see what was coming next down the line, if this was going to happen. If we look back to the UK as a whole, whenever lockdowns first happened, it was a couple of days before you would have had the media saying that schools need to close or whatever, and then a couple of days later that's what would happen. But in many cases this was very, very last minute.
And you've alluded to the some of the difficulties, but did that cause any difficulties for the members?
Financially, absolutely did. If you take a standard cost roughly of about 5,000 odd pounds every time, £5,500 every time you open and close, and on many occasions some of these businesses closed and opened 6-7 times. That's a cost. Stock that was ordered, being prepared, for the week, because if you're opening Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that stock has to be ordered on a Tuesday, Wednesday to be delivered fresh for the weekend. That stock was in many cases wasted, and that's one thing that hospitality is quite strong. They don't like wastage, but I have to say on many occasions a lot of the food went to either homeless places or to local economy, local residents in the towns. Beer that was being out of stock, that had to be tipped down the drains, so the financial cost was horrendous.
And you provided with the Rule 8 response, Mr Montgomery, an appendix of closure costs. Could we please have SCI SHG XXX number 1 on screen? So it's quite small across there, but can you read that okay?
Yes, yeah.
You've set out there a number of line costs. Are these the kinds of things that you were alluding to a moment ago?
That's exactly right, yes.
And we can see on there there's costs to close the outlets, there's costs to reopen the outlets, there's fixed costs over the piece while outlets are closed. Furlough top-up, I take it that to mean effectively employee salaries, etc.
That's correct.
And those are all costs which very roughly by my maths comes to around, I think it's actually an even higher figure than you've got there, about £10,000 I think actually. Yeah. And then you've indicated on there average grants of less than £3,000, so we can see that significant shortfall. Yeah. And again, just to be clear, that's for one closure, as it were.
Yeah, that's for one closure and one unit. So that's not a company closure, that's just per unit.
And as you indicated, businesses were closing 5 or 6 times, so every time they closed and reopened, they were incurring these costs.
That's correct.
Did you raise this issue with anybody?
It was a constant raising of the same issue all the time with government. We know that we needed financial support. And one of the biggest things was when we first went into lockdown, the UK government were giving in England every single business, whether you were a business A but had 20 units in that business, they were all getting the same support. Whether it be £10,000, £25,000, so up to £18,000 rateable value was getting £10,000, up to I think it was 51,000 was getting next, 25,000, but everybody was getting something, and those above it were getting something. But here in Scotland, at the very, very start, it was if you was business A and you had 10 units in that one business, you only got the one grant. So you only got that 10,000 or that 25,000. So it was a big push there, and eventually, I think at the time it was Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop at the time. She changed on that and put it to 100% for your first unit and then 75% of whatever the grant was for the rest. But that was still a shortfall of 25% for every other unit.
Thank you. And in terms of this rotation, this cycle of opening and closing, did you discuss that with anyone?
Yeah, again, this was raised many, many times with government and with officials, the amount of times we were closing. I think it'd be fair to say that hospitality as a sector wanted to be open. We felt that we were a safe place for people to go. And I think we we put a submission in, that we did a survey, a public survey on where people thought they felt more safe. Did they feel safer in a hospitality venue with all the protections that we had in place, track and trace, all those kinds of things, or did they feel better in a retail environment? And I think it was 94-95% said that they felt safer in a hospitality venue, because again, as the things we had in place. But I think from a government level, they were looking at the evidence coming forward from the Chief Medical Advisor, etc., and looking at hospitality as being an unsafe place to be. And I give an example of that where we did a survey across our members where we had between the 15th of July 2021 and the 30th of September 2021, we had 1.8 million customers through the door, 6,000 staff in that time on shifts. We had 10 customers which reported back to us with having COVID and 7 staff. So I think that firmly demonstrates from our own group the measures that we are putting in place, probably over and above other issues that were being given to us from government on protection, that we were actually a safe place to be.
Thank you. I think we do. Yes.
If you haven't got it, Lord, I can certainly pass that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could we please look at document SCI SHG XXX number 4? And if we could just scroll up just a little bit more, please. I'm looking at the line that starts "Let us trade." This is a letter that you've provided to the inquiry, Mr. Montgomery. It's a letter from yourself. It's not dated, but it's a letter from yourself to Mr. Ewing. Could you tell us who Mr. Ewing is, first of all?
Yeah, couple of seconds first. He was Minister for Tourism, Hospitality at the time, and I have to say, Mr. Ewing was, in my view, personal view, very open to discussions, and even today, I think I would say that we have still got a really good relationship with him.
Thank you. As I say, the letter's not dated. Do you recall when this letter was written?
I would have to go back and find that out for you. I think this was when it was coming into the end of the furlough scheme, and then going into the framework and the level system. I think that was probably at that time.
Thank you. And as you can see, you can't see actually, if you could just roll down a little bit from there, sorry. Other way, excuse me. I suppose I mean roll up. Thank you, just there. You're writing to him and you set out there our ask, and you say our goal here and the ask from us is actually very simple. Let us trade viably or order us to close and compensate us properly.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Okay, this is relating to when JSS, Job Support Scheme, came out. There was 2 levels of Job Support Scheme. There was a level where if you were closed, you got a higher amount of support than what you did if you were open. That was a smaller amount of support. But many hospitality businesses, when they were open, with the amount of restrictions we had around the social distancing and everything else was concerned, and I take it from my own unit at the time, my own hotel, where we had 8 tables in one room, we could only actually get 2. So the viability to trade profitably, we were actually losing money by being open. So this was in relation to, and I think we set out a chart of what units or what type of hospitality businesses would actually still remain profitable by being open and what wouldn't. So if we were being forced to close at that time to stop us losing money, to get the JSS, the Job Support System scheme, it would have been more financially viable for us than what it would have been to be open.
And that's over and above, as we discussed, the cycle of opening and closing.
Exactly right. Yeah.
And what is the consequence for that in terms of businesses being open or being closed? Is there a consequence in terms of which is preferable at any given time?
I think if the level of support was correct, although, as I said previously, hospitality would have always wanted to remain open. Not just for the profitability of the businesses, but also for the mental health of our consumers, and also from our staff as well, because bear in mind they've been locked away for so long. Opening and closing businesses willy-nilly, it just loses everything we're all about. It's a financial cost to business. We weren't sure we were going to be getting extra grants. We kept being told that there's no money left in the pot. So whenever we were being shut down again, we weren't actually sure whether there was going to be funding available to actually support. And even when we were getting the funding, there wasn't enough money to support it. So being closed, if we were getting financial support, we knew what we were getting through the door. We could budget more than what we would have done if we were open and close, and not knowing what we were getting.
Thank you. You mentioned a moment ago measures being taken by businesses in terms of protecting customers, or because they've ordered to do so in terms of space, etc. Are you able to tell His Lordship any more about the kinds of measures that were being implemented?
Yeah, certainly, My Lordship. We, from my own business, for example.
Any knowledge you have, Mr. Montgomery?
We, my own team, every day before they come into work, we had a WhatsApp group, and everybody would have sent in photographs of their swabs, they're taking COVID tests, etc. Any line at all, they were kept away from work. We had dividers in between tables to try and mitigate any spread. That was one of the advisory things that government put in place. There was track and trace involved. There was face coverings, obviously. There was staff training involved around how we speak to consumers on the phone. For example, whenever they were ringing to maybe book a table, we asked them a various amount of questions. Have you any symptoms? When's the last time you had COVID? Have you had your vaccinations? All those kinds of things to try and, I think, give the consumers and our staff the ability to understand that we were doing the right thing, and give them a bit of hope, if you like. Because one thing about hospitality is you don't miss it until it's gone. And I think that's exactly what happened during lockdown. And slightly diverting a wee bit, that's why a lot of people then started to build their bars in their back gardens. They missed that social interaction. And again, that alluded to when the police were actually given powers of entry into houses, because what the the house owners were inviting their neighbours and all that kind of thing. But that's what hospitality is about. It's about socialising. And people missed that because they got probably bored with their own four walls, and they wanted that, that hospitality from other people. So it was trying to give the consumer that, understanding and that bit of hope.
You've obviously talked a lot about the different measures and the rules that were being imposed upon the hospitality industry. You were involved in some of the development, or at least in some of the consultation in respect of those rules. Did you feel that the rules that were being adopted were appropriate or rational?
I think if we give one example where when the level system was being devised, myself and colleagues from other trade bodies spent probably a full weekend trying to devise a plan or a policy where we knew, and that probably relates back to this previously, what businesses would be able to open when, what would be profitable, when we'd be allowed to serve alcohol, when we shouldn't. It was around hotels where we had people coming in, but they weren't allowed to have a drink. They weren't allowed to have anything after 6:30 at night or 6 o'clock at night, which felt very, what's the difference in cut off at 6 o'clock at night and 10 o'clock at night? Omicron or COVID didn't understand times. It didn't understand borders. And we also looked at areas around, personally, we're on the border, but England had different rules to Scotland. And a lot of the time, the information that we were putting into government would have been as much information as we could through diagrams, through emails, etc. But a lot of the time we felt that wasn't listened to. We felt that it was a tick box exercise. And there was no real explanation around the music ban, what that was about. It's just something that happened, and it was on from the August right the way through to the December. So
You've mentioned the music ban there a couple of times, Mr. Montgomery. Can you explain to His Lordship what exactly that was?
So we were told that 14th of August, I think that came in, and it stopped on the 10th December, 10th of December, somewhere around that time. So no background music was to be played in any hospitality venue, and all televisions were to be put on mute. Now, I'm not sure why, that would happen. If you go into a hospitality venue and you've got two tables sat beside, and then talk about a restaurant venue, for example, two tables sat close to each other, and you're having a nice meal with your partner, you don't really want the table next to you understanding or listening to what your conversation is. So that music, it not just gives atmosphere, it also gives the breakdown and that distance as well, so that people don't actually always hear other people's conversation. From a government point of view, I think it was because they thought that the more drink people got, the more louder they got, which in time then, with it being an airborne disease that it could spread. Yes, we get that, but we're in the business. Operators know what we can do. In a restaurant venue, you don't have people shouting. The more drink they get. That's not the case. Maybe different in the nighttime industry, but nighttime industry, nightclubs, etc., were closed for far, far longer than anybody else. As was the venues in Glasgow. They were closed. I think Glasgow was closed longer than anywhere in the UK during the COVID.
Just to kind of unpick some of that, Mr. Montgomery. So, the purpose of music or sound, television in a bar, as you say, one of its purposes is to separate people's conversations so people can't hear each other. Are you able to tell His Lordship what the consequence is if you remove that music in terms of people's behaviour?
Yeah, Lordship, I think it diminishes the experience as well of people coming out. People have been locked up for so long and want to come out and have that atmosphere. So you're walking into a restaurant where there is no atmosphere at all, because background music actually is part of that. And taking it away, you're hearing everybody talking behind the bar and giving orders out, or whatever the case is, or what's happening on each individual table. There's nothing private and nothing atmospheric about having a hospitality venue without any music. And I would task you all, I think the next time you go out to a hospitality venue, to imagine that venue in a small intimate restaurant where there's no music, and think back to that.
And you mentioned their private conversations. If you were in that environment and you wanted to have a private conversation, are you able to tell His Lordship what you would likely do?
I think that private conversation wouldn't happen. I think it would be more about, oh, that's nice meal or whatever it is. It may well encourage conversation between the other two tables, or the other tables, whatever it was in the restaurant. But the purpose of going out for a meal is to socialise with the people you're out with, or in a bar or a restaurant, whatever the case may be. It's not to talk about in a normal capacity when you go out now, when you have all these things back. How's your day been, or whatever the case is. You don't want people in another table and looking at or listening to what you're saying.
In terms of the announcement of the music ban, are you able to tell His Lordship when that was announced and how that was announced?
I think it was announced on the 14th of August, and that was on a call, my lord, with government and advisors, where they said that this was coming in. There was talk of some nightclub places having some experimental work done on it. I don't think we ever got the results of that. It came as a bit of a shock to us, because it was one of those that we didn't know was coming down the line. And I think, again, it would be possible that this policy was something that we need to be seen to be doing something rather than doing nothing. And if I can allude further to that being on the border with England and Scotland, we had an outflux of people on trains going from Edinburgh, Glasgow, on the trains to England, to Carlisle or to Newcastle, and certainly myself down the borders where I am in Dumfries and Galloway. We lost so many people to England, where they could go into restaurants, bars, etc., and have that enjoyment of having music or being able to dance or enjoy a social night out. But we didn't have that in Scotland.
As a dweller of the borders, I can testify.
Sorry, my lord?
As a dweller in the borders on the other side, I can testify. There's a lot of people went to Berwick a lot.
Absolutely, my lord, yeah.
You've mentioned there the complication of the border between the two nations. there were obviously other borders within Scotland created by the tier systems. Were there any complications arising out of that?
Yes, I think, especially from Glasgow's point of view and the Central Belt, whenever they went into lockdown in what was supposed to be the short, sharp shock of October, when it lasted for over 200 days, it was supposed to be 3 weeks, and lasted for over 200 days. That was one issue. The other was the different tier system where Glasgow remained in level 3, I think it was, for longer than anybody else. Yes, they still continued to get some support, but that travel to and from different areas was a bit of an issue, especially for maybe some people who were travelling to work in different areas where they maybe couldn't have a social night out after work in Glasgow, but they could when they were back at home. But they were still travelling back and forward, so you often wondered why. People travelling into different areas, not understanding that in level 3 that you couldn't have a drink at all, but in level 2 possibly you could have a drink outside but not inside, and maybe go to another level 1 close to them where actually they could have a drink inside and out. So that complicated level system was quite hard for us as businesses to get across the consumer, and that's why we were putting all the guidance out that we could around everywhere, and a lot of our businesses obviously put their own websites out. Every update that came, we would direct customers to our websites or to our social media posts to say, when you come into our venue, this is what you can do, or this is what you can't do. And it's not, don't take it out on the staff. This isn't our game.
You mentioned they're not taking it on the staff. Did you find anyone taking it out on the staff?
Absolutely, we did, and I think one of those was a lot of that was directed in the latter times during when we were being told to go and get our vaccinations. Nighttime industry opened up, and you weren't allowed to go into a nighttime venue, nightclub, etc., unless you had a vaccination in the passport, which was a big one because door staff were then having to check passports, etc., digital passports and phones. Some people was their right, I guess, not to have vaccination, but they were being victimised, if you like, and that they couldn't go into a nightclub or whatever, although they'd maybe been testing at home and knew they were COVID free, which was always the case anyway. We would ask people to test before they come out. They knew they were COVID free, but because they didn't have the COVID passport, they were getting the door staff were getting abuse. Certainly down the phone, some of our own team, my own restaurant and a hotel were getting abuse because, well, how come we can go to England and we can do this and we can do that, but we're Carlisle or Gretna, just over the border as well, in Gretna, because we've got a bar which is just on the border there, that where people in Gretna could actually just walk across the border 100 yards and do things that they couldn't do in Scotland. So there was that, yes, it certainly was that abuse. Not by a lot of people, I have to say, but we did get the individual ones. And I think that a lot of that came from being locked down for so long. People just wanted to get out and couldn't understand why they were being still under some kind of restriction.
You talked there about the potential for abuse of staff. Were there any other impacts that you'd like to highlight in respect of staff?
I think not a lot was ever talked about the mental health of our teams. And it's something that I'm very, very passionate about. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, we would have a own business, just a Zoom call with everybody, just to what you're up to. And 9 times out of 10, people are still sat in their pajamas. That's just the way COVID was. And we would try and get them to go out for a walk, or the phone was on 24/7. If you wanted to talk, if you wanted to offload anything, just lift the phone. I mean, again, I was in a hotel of my own, so I was quite happy to take that on board. But beyond that, I think employers and business owners were under so much pressure to make sure that their own staff and their own businesses were being looked after, and certainly they had that ownership of making sure that their staff were kept in their own mental health state. But nobody was actually looking after the employers. Nobody, and even to this day, we are being tasked with doing so much for our employees, whether that be working time directive, you know, all the stuff that goes on with around that, wages, etc., etc. When we're doing that, being forced to do that by a government, however, we're doing that to protect our staff. However, nobody's looking after the employer, and that still happens today. And I don't think there's enough made of the mental health challenges that we have in our sector.
Thank you. We've talked about the various lines of communication and the discussions that you were party to, and the quite an array of matters that were being discussed. You also mentioned the fact you were joining calls with potentially 70 or 80 people on that call. Do you feel that the engagement that you were having with government during this time was meaningful?
I would think some of it was meaningful, but I would also think that some of it was just, we have to be seen to be doing something. For us, for myself personally, again, any call that was going out, I wanted to be on it. I think there's two reasons for that. Maybe one, because I'm nosy and want to see what's going on, and I want to be able to spread that word around, whether it involved us or not, whether it was something to do with association of self-catering, or whether it be you know, another, you know, bed and breakfast people. Whatever the case was, it didn't matter. If I was on it from a hospitality point of view, and somebody rang me from outside that hadn't got hospitality, you know, we had people from beauticians, taxi people ringing us. So any information that we could gather from any meeting, we were being able to, you know, give them that. And even back to the taxis, whenever they were getting no grants at all, you've got to bear in mind, hospitality encompasses so many businesses, whether it be taxis, beauticians, etc., etc. When we suffer, everybody else suffers outside us. And I think if COVID did anything, it made others realise the impact that a closure of hospitality sector has on other sectors within the economy. So in answer to your question, I think some of the calls probably didn't relate to us, but it was good to be involved in them, so we could pass that information on to others as well.
So from that, you gained, I suppose, from being in the room and hearing these things. On the other side of the coin, in terms of your input back to Scottish Government, do you feel that was taken into account?
I think it was listened to, but I don't think it was really actioned on. And I go back to the point where we spent a full weekend looking at the level system and what that would mean for hospitality. We presented that to government on the Monday, and the level scheme came out on the Tuesday. So if we were being tasked with devising a policy over the weekend, and that was just whenever you're allowed to go out to self-catering units outside your own area, but with your own family. And I was on my way, actually, whenever I got the call on the Friday, to Stirling to spend a weekend away. And that whole weekend was just spent with other trade bodies devising policy. And we presented to government the Monday, and on Tuesday we got something which didn't really relate to what we had suggested at all. So it begged the question from us all, was that a weekend spent just for a tick box exercise? Was that level system already pre-made, ready to go? Because I would suspect that would have had to have had Cabinet approval, because Cabinet would have met on the Tuesday, I think. And then for it to come out on that Tuesday, to me, could have possibly made, well, actually, did our input actually matter?
Thank you.
I'd like to think it did matter, but...
I'd like to ask you now some questions about financial support. You've mentioned a number of schemes that were available to your members over the pandemic period. First of all, could I ask about the hospitality group itself? Did that organisation, well, first of all, we heard that organisation was set up during the pandemic. Did it receive any financial assistance for its work?
No, we received absolutely no financial assistance, and all the work that I did from 2020, when we formed, right the way through until we've legally formed in 2023, was done on a voluntary basis.
Thank you. And then turning to the members' financial support, could you give us you've mentioned, as I say, a couple of schemes already, but could you tell His Lordship the kinds of other financial support that were available, or indeed if you want to touch upon the main things that were available for your members?
Yeah, certainly, my Lord. We had this. Everybody got the same kind of grants, whether it be closure grants. There wasn't very many available. The first grant we got was the media closure grant after the lockdown in March. But again, in Scotland, it was a big fight to try and get that changed. So anybody up to 18,000 got £10,000 as a one-off cost. Anybody up to £51,000 of rateable value got a £25,000 payment. Anybody over and above £51,000 rateable value got absolutely nothing. And our argument against that was, what's the difference in the rateable value? You may have a restaurant, for example, or a bar, which is smaller than smaller but has a bigger rateable value than a large bar or restaurant living somewhere where it's below the rateable value for grants. They still had the same cost pressures. So it took us a long time to get that changed. We didn't get it changed originally, although what we did get changed was the fact that, as I said earlier on, where the second, third and fourth units within that business got a 75% of what they were entitled to. When we got the 90 or £100 million investment or grant system, we were looking at devising who was going to get that money. The first thing we did and agreed with the other trade bodies was, or hospitality trade bodies was, that those with a rateable value over £51,000 straight away got £25,000 because they had received absolutely nothing previously to that. Now £25,000 to them maybe wasn't a lot of money. But it was something, and it was all we were able to do, given the confines of what we were given previously as a block grant. Others received like £10,000, but the bulk of that money went to those who hadn't received anything. So that was basically the grants that were actually given. Furlough was another big saviour for many people. But at the very start, there was no tax and national insurance having to be paid on that. At the very start. However, that changed, and businesses then had to pay the national insurance, the holiday pay, and the pension contributions on top of that. And then obviously it was 80%. Some businesses chose to pay the extra 20% to make it up. But others, however, because of the financial viability of it, didn't do that. But they still had that, and which is alluded to in some of our submissions. It was a big cost to them.
Thank you. And how did your members find the speed of the availability of that support?
I think it'd be fair to say that depending on the council area, depended on how quick the grants were going out, my lord. And I think at the very start it was slow. And speaking from my own area, Dumfries and Galloway, they were, and I think I put that in one of our submissions, they were quite quick. And I think a lot of that's got to do with we're rural, rather than take Glasgow, for example, which is quite condensed and they would have a lot more work to do. But as the grant system moved on and we got over the initial hurdles of people not being on the Scottish Assessor's roll, the wrong names being on the rolls, etc., and there probably are still even some today where we've seen landlords being able to claim the money rather than the actual leaseholder. As that went on through the pandemic, I think it got easier because the systems were then starting to get in place, and I think that's why the non-domestic rates, or the SAA rateable values, was the chosen route for dishing out grants. Whether that was the right route, my lord, or not, I'm not actually quite sure, because every business differs in their costs, and which has been alluded to in our submission.
Thank you. You've obviously alluded to a number of issues, and this is probably quite a broad question given the granular nature of the various things that you've talked about. But overall, what was your view of the adequacy of the financial support that was provided?
I think the obvious answer is that there wasn't enough financial support. Nobody will know other than government whether all the money that came from UK government to Scottish government for support was actually used. I would hope that it was, although there have been some questions raised about that. But I don't think even in the rest of the UK there was enough financial support. I think hospitality was just taken for granted of always going to be there. The costs around running a hospitality business, I don't think there was any understanding around that either. We're very labour intensive. You know, we can't put self-scanners in and things like that there that retail can do, so we are heavily burdensome. So the national insurance costs and the pension costs and everything during lockdown and the furlough scheme had a heavy effect on our businesses. So it's a difficult one to really answer in a proper answer.
Thank you. We've talked about the pandemic period. You've also mentioned the fact that the hospitality group has continued in its operations after the pandemic. I'd like to ask you some questions now about, I suppose, the ongoing impacts and how matters stand at the moment. I mean, have businesses recovered from the pandemic?
No. There's a simple answer to that, my lord. No. Businesses during the pandemic, because of the lack of support that they were getting, they were in many ways forced into taking bounce back loans. Some larger businesses took CBIL loans. Hospitality has seen so many businesses go to the wall in Scotland, and I think in a latest report there's twice as many licensed hospitality businesses closing in Scotland as what there is in England and Wales. Northern Ireland is a bit different. I'm not sure what the situation is there, because it works in a different framework. Many of these businesses are still trying to pay back their pay back their bounce back loans. So many of them, and I think we've alluded to it in some of our submission, have still trying to be paying back their deferred VAT, national insurance, all those kinds of things, at a time when now they're faced with heavier utility bills, increased costs as far as utility costs, supplier costs, and now after the UK budget, which we've seen an absolutely hammer blow to our hospitality sector with the lowering of the 9,100 national insurance to 5,000, and then the raising to 15% of national insurance on top of the national minimum wage increases as well. Many of our hospitality businesses, or most certainly of our hospitality businesses across SESG, don't pay the national living wage or national minimum wage. They pay more than that. But although our employees, and quite rightly, I have to say, would expect, the difference with the difference in between what the national minimum wage is now and what will be in April. And if I can give an example where for one of our members alone, the cost of the bottom line for him is £4 million next year. So that, my lord, is an absolutely hammer blow to a time when hospitality is trying to recover after a pandemic, trying to employ more people, trying to pay more into the economy that we're trying to boost, and all the time we just seem to be getting this hammer blow.
You've mentioned obviously the difficulties for businesses and some of them ultimately closing. Even the businesses that are surviving, are there any financial implications for them?
I think a lot of people, my lord, now are looking at where we're going to be in April next year with a new financial year. Some small businesses and hospitality by nature want to be open 7 days a week. We don't want to be closing. However, with the increased pressures on business, there's only so much that we can increase our prices by. And if I give you a sort of an analogy, if you've got your ceiling coming down because you've got a leak in your ceiling or leak in your pipes up the stairs, and your plumber says, listen, I'm £50 an hour, you have no choice but to pay the plumber £50 an hour, whatever the case is. But that same person has a choice whether he wants to come in a hospitality business or not. They can walk by our door. They don't have to. The increase in people buying alcohol from supermarkets, etc., or buying, takeaways, home deliveries, fast food, etc., has expanded seriously high. So to the demise of our hospitality venues. Yes, our cities, some of them, Edinburgh, are still very buoyant, but other areas, rural Scotland, other towns and cities aren't. So a lot of people are looking at now closing Monday, Tuesday, we already see it. Some people, and certainly in my own business, looking at April next year, we are looking to see whether we are going to be viable staying open Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or do we close Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and just open at the more profitable times. The national insurance increase coming along in April will mean to me a cost of probably a 22 hour post every week, which is one of my kitchen porters. So I now got to look at what we do with that cost. And I go back to what I say, there's only so much we can add to the consumer price. Because if I look at, again, my own business, at the cost, we're going to look at probably 14% across the board on all our food and beverage. Now that puts a fish and chips in the menu up to over £20. It's the same fish, it's the same chips, it's the same member of staff, it's the same chair that you're sitting on. However, the consumer coming in possibly doesn't have that money, and they're looking for more value for the money that they've got in their pocket because of our increases. So we are sitting now, depending what happens to the budget today, of course, but we're sitting now at a point where governments really need to, both UK and in Scotland, really need to look at where hospitality sits on the radar.
Thank you. You've mentioned staff a few times there, Mr. Montgomery. Is there any change to the staffing situation for businesses at the moment? We
found during COVID and lockdown that particularly chefs, I think, a lot of them went on to take second jobs, because even you were getting furlough, you could have took a second job, so you were getting a second job wage, plus you're getting 80% of furlough from your main job. A lot of chefs seen a better lifestyle, going to work for, delivery companies, whatever the case was. They didn't maybe have to work weekends, etc. So when we started to open up, we got an influx of people saying they weren't coming back. That was a big issue. We still haven't fully recovered from that. I think hospitality employed around 240, 250,000 people pre-COVID in Scotland. Now it's down to about 175 after COVID. So we still have a gap to fill. And that, again, alludes to the point where a lot of businesses are closed on a Monday and Tuesday because they can't get the staff. And a lot of businesses, are looking at India, for example, where we've had a lot of people coming in, chefs, senior managers from India and other areas, to try and plug that gap. But I think where we need to be is getting into our schools a lot earlier than what we do just now. So instead of getting into third, fourth year schools to try and promote hospitality, we need to be getting in at the end of primary school and then into secondary school. We need to grow our homegrown talent, because we have some fantastic people in our hospitality businesses. And again, I go back to one of my own staff who we took her on at 16 2 years ago, and she knew absolutely nothing about hospitality, just wanted a job. And on a Saturday night now, I can leave her to run my floor as a waitress. She's absolutely top notch, and we've given her them skills. Sadly, we're going to lose her. She's going to do biochemistry. However, we give her that starting point. But the fact still remains, we need to have homegrown talent going forward.
Thank you. I could ask you questions, I suppose, for quite a long time this morning, Mr. Montgomery. I'm conscious we just have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to, in a moment, give you an opportunity, if there is anything that you particularly want to raise with His Lordship, or anything that you feel His Lordship might want to consider that we haven't had an opportunity to discuss, then now will be your opportunity to do that. Is there anything that you'd like His Lordship to know that we haven't discussed this morning?
I think, Your Lordship, the lessons learned, I think we need to get them into the basket and learn from them. Should there be, touch wood, there isn't, but touch wood, if something does happen again, that the views of businesses are absolutely taken on board. Businesses, certainly in hospitality, they know what it takes to run a business. They know the costs. They know everything about it. They know their staff inside out. They know their consumers inside out. So I think governments in England, in the UK and in Scotland, need to take on board our comments and not just throw them away and put them in a box for again. We are an important part of the economy. We will always be an important part of the economy. I think we contribute £6 billion to the Scottish economy and a further £3 billion through our supply chain every year. So we shouldn't be taken for granted at any time. And certainly during the COVID pandemic, it was felt that it's okay as hospitality. And some of the freedom of information stuff that we asked for, it was clear to see that in some of the meetings that were taking place, hospitality was never represented. We had Chamber of Commerce, we had the Institute of Directors, but we didn't have any hospitality representation on those. So I think that for me is one of the biggest take-backs. And hospitality is a safe place, always was a safe place in our view. And our motto, if you like, for during the COVID was we were a part of the solution, not part of the problem. And we continually came to the table with solutions. I think, Lord, that would be all I would have.
My Lord, I don't have any further questions unless your Lordship wishes to ask anything.
Nope, I'm fine, thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Lord.
Montgomery, I'm very grateful. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
Let me check. 11:30. Thank you.
All rise.
Right, Mr. Turner.
My lord. The next witness is Ms. Rosina Robson from the National Hair and Beauty Federation.
Very good. Good morning, Miss Robson.
Good morning.
Now, you're going to be asked some questions.
Very good.
When you're ready, Mr. Turner.
My lord. Ms. Robson, before we start, if I could just remind you that today's hearing will be transcribed. If you could try and speak slowly and clearly, that will help, and it will prevent my solicitor giving me a dig as we go along to try and slow down. Could you please state your full name?
Yes, Rosina Robson.
Thank you. And you're here on behalf of the National Hair and Beauty Federation, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And the National Hair and Beauty Federation has provided a written response to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry. And my lord, that is reference SCI NHBFXX number 1. And Ms. Robson, you provided that in a number of documents to the inquiry. We are going to touch upon some of the things that you've mentioned in that document this morning. We may not get to everything, but please rest assured that all documents, including that response, will be taken into account in the inquiry and will form part of the record. Excuse me. You're here today representing the Federation. Could you tell us what your position is within the Federation?
Yes, I'm Director of Policy and Public Affairs.
Thank you. And how long have you held that position?
I've been in the role since August 2021, so more than a little bit over 3 years.
Thank you. And just in general terms, what does that role involve?
It's really looking after all the NHBF's relationship with government, both in the UK and with the Scottish Government as well, and also our relationship with Parliament and the devolved administrations and assemblies.
Thank you. It may be apparent from its name, but perhaps I could just ask you to explain to His Lordship what the Federation actually is.
Yes, the National Hair and Beauty Federation is a trade association. It's one of the largest trade associations in the hair, beauty and barbering sector. We've been operating since 1942, so we've been around a while, and we have members, primarily salons, barbershops, beauty salons on the high street and operating across the UK in cities, towns, villages, and we represent those people that are salon-based, so both salon owners and also the self-employed operating within salons as well.
Thank you. And are you able to tell us how many members that you currently have?
Yes, we have around 5,000 members UK-wide, and about 400 of those are based in Scotland.
Thank you. And were there any changes to the numbers of those members during the pandemic?
Yes, there were actually. We had an overall uplift of about 1,500 members over the course of the three lockdowns of the pandemic. There was an uplift started about June 2020, I think, and then a year later there was another uplift. But I think the rate of member increase in Scotland was slightly higher than in England and in the rest of the UK. I think there was a sort of element of maybe not panic purchase, but businesses looking for an additional level of support and to feel like they were part of a community and that they could access, good advice when they needed it.
Thank you. I'd like to give His Lordship a bit of an idea about the industry that the Federation operates in. So I have a few questions about the sector itself. Are you able to say how many hair and beauty businesses there are in Scotland?
Well, we have, as I mentioned, we have 400 members, but out of the UK-wide, there's just under 50,000 hair and beauty businesses that are that are registered, we've done estimates that say that on top of that, there's about 40% in addition of businesses that sort of aren't captured by official data. But in Scotland, there's about 4,000 hair and beauty businesses.
And in financial terms, are you able to say what the industry's contribution is to the economy?
Well, collectively, UK-wide, collective turnover sits at just under 4.6 billion. But specific to Scotland, that collective turnover has decreased over the last few years, and it sits at around 375 million.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now about the demographics of the kinds of people, and indeed the numbers of people who work in the industry. Are you able to tell His Lordship how many people are engaged in health and beauty in the UK and indeed in Scotland?
In terms of employees, it's around 240,000 UK-wide. And that's the services side of the industry rather than the retail. So that's, as I mentioned before, your sort of salon, people working in salons and barbershops and beauty salons across the UK. And there's a large number of, as you'd probably expect, female employees. So that sits at about 86%. And a large number of young people as well. So about half of the workforce is between 16 and 34, I think.
Thank you. And you've talked there about the employees. In terms of the owners and the operators of businesses, can you tell us anything about them in terms of their makeup?
Yes, well, in terms of owners, female entrepreneurship is very strong within the sector as well. So, as you'd expect, high numbers of female-owned businesses, and there are a large number of family-owned businesses as well that get passed between different generations, and maybe the husband and wife or the father-daughter relationship is there. But primarily, the sector is characterised by female-run businesses.
Thank you. You've obviously given us details there in terms of age. It tends to be quite young in terms of female involvement in the industry. Are there any other characteristics that set the industry apart in terms of the types of people who work in it?
Well, one statistic we use is that, and we think about a lot when we communicate with our membership base and with the sector, is that you've got a high proportion of neurodiversity within the sector. So we estimate it to be up to about 60% of people working within the sector. So and because of that, we think very carefully about our communications. You know, we make sure that they're straightforward, visual. We use bullet points, and we try not to use too much prose when we communicate with them. So that's something we're very wary of, or aware of, should I say.
Thank you. You've mentioned there female entrepreneurs, and you talked about the fact that the Federation itself deals primarily with salon owners and indeed sole traders that operate within salons as well. It's implicit from what you're saying there that there are different ways and different businesses within salons. Are you able to tell His Lordship about those different business operations that go on in salons and in other places?
Well, as I say, we as you pointed out, we represent salon owners and also people who are working on a self-employed basis within those salons. And it's certainly been, the shift to self-employment has certainly been a trend that's accelerated since COVID. When we've done research around it, it's very clear that there's a lot of people in the sector who want to take autonomy over the way they work, the way they run their business. So at the moment, self-employment sits at about 2/3 of workers within the sector. So it's obviously sort of quite a strong characteristic to the sector. And there are businesses that have purely employees. There are others that run a hybrid model where they might have some employees within the business and some self-employed, and others, as I say, that work purely on a self-employed basis.
And just to be clear, when you're saying they're operating on a self-employed basis, when one walks into a salon, what does that actually look like?
Well, it means that individual is renting a chair or space within that business for an agreed set of terms, and so they're operating to a certain extent autonomously from the business owner and that particular salon.
And so, therefore, if you're looking at a business and you're looking at a number of hairdressers or beauty practitioners, each one of those could be an individual business within that store, that salon.
It could be, and as I say, it has been a growing trend since COVID. Although the rate has been levelling off over the last year or so. But I mean, business owners do try, and particularly if they're running a hybrid model, you know, they try and still create a team within their business and look after their business brand and find ways to bring together the staff and those self-employed individuals as well through training and development.
Thank you. We're talking about the sector as a whole here. I appreciate that you've indicated which parts of the sector the Federation represents. I don't know if you're able to tell us more widely whether people in the sector operate in different ways to salons. Are there any other ways that hair and beauty is delivered?
Well, there are ways. I mean, some of our members, for example, might operate services on a mobile basis, but they do that in addition to the services they offer within the salon. There are separate organisations that look after the freelance part of. So there's a freelance association for hairdressers, and they would be operating perhaps in venues that are maybe attached to the home or in a slightly different location from being in the salon.
Thank you. And when you say, just to be clear, when you say mobile businesses, what do you mean by that?
Well, individuals that move from go to domestic premises, go from home to home and offer services or at different locations that way rather than operating from a salon.
Thank you. Again, talking broadly about the sector, are you able to tell us very generally about what the effect of COVID was on the operations of the sector?
Well, I think it's safe to say that the sector was severely impacted by COVID and the 3 periods of lockdowns and then the restrictions that carried on after those lockdowns. I mean, in 2020, I think it was 140 days of lockdown, and collectively over the three lockdowns, it was more than I think 240 days. So those are all days when it's not possible. Business is closed. It's not possible to operate. You don't have clients coming in, and some businesses supplemented their income through online sales of products. But that was only, for a certain period of time, and really, businesses were looking to get people back into their businesses as soon as possible.
And in terms of trends, I suppose, in terms of the effect of COVID, are you able to tell us anything about staff, in terms of the impact that it had on staff in businesses?
Well, it's certainly a major theme throughout the lockdowns and throughout that period, sort of 2020 to 2022, was mental health of both the business owner and their staff. And throughout that period, we were running regular quarterly surveys. So we run our State of the Industry survey, which goes both to members but also to the wider sector. And at the time, we were getting it was a captive audience, so we were getting between 500 and over 1,000 responses. So it gave us a really good sample size and a really good feel of what was going on in the sector. And And consistently, when we asked about what were the key issues in your business, the key concerns moving forward, I mean, mental health of both the business owner and the staff was up there in the top three, essentially. I mean, that started to ease as we got into 2022, but no, I'd say it was a major theme. And I think something that's, I mean, we talked before about the economic value of the sector, you know, the strong presence of the sector on the high street, but I think a theme that's not always fully appreciated is the well-being aspect to what the sector offers, and in particular, if you think about staff within that business dealing on a day-to-day basis with clients coming in that have, you know, we all went through it, but, you know, that awful time, and sharing those experiences time after time after time after time. You know, that was something even after the after lockdown and businesses were opened up, that those businesses were dealing with and grappling with, you know, looking after kids, considering looking after the health of their mental health of their own staff, and thinking about how they could best interact with their clients as well.
And did these kinds of issues, I mean, have they had any impact on the numbers of people involved in the sector?
There's certainly been a trend since, well, throughout COVID, a number of people did leave for various reasons, because obviously in the sector we went through a period of lockdowns and uncertainty, and businesses weren't open. So there was certainly a trend, and we set out this in a bit more detail in a skills report we published in 2022, showing that actually, because there was a lot of uncertainty and because businesses couldn't be open and there were continuing restrictions, there was a shift from hair and beauty to other parts of retail and hospitality, and also to the care sector as well. I think there was a feeling that from some people that there were not more secure ways of having employment at that particular time. And I think there was also a bit of a hangover from Brexit as well, when you had perhaps some more experienced people in the sector that had moved and gone back to their original European countries. So I think there's sort of different waves of things going on in the sector. But certainly it was very clear, if you look at the, I think the statistics we supplied, there was a drop both during COVID, significant drop in employees, but also in 2022 as well, you know, about 18,000. So sector employees dropped, you know, significantly, really. So yeah, it was a very, very clear shift.
Thank you. And you mentioned when we spoke a moment ago about the turnover in the sector of being £375 million. Is that a change from the position pre-pandemic?
I think the data I provided showed that essentially from the start of the pandemic, the collective turnover in Scotland was more like 465 million in 2019-20, and then it dropped to 399 million in 2021, and then 2022-23 was 375 million. So a clear decline in terms of the overall contribution of the sector.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you now about financial support for the sector during the pandemic. First of all, I'd like to talk about the sort of initial period. Was financial support forthcoming for the industry?
I think both from a UK perspective and from a Scottish Government perspective, I think there was a suite of support provided by both governments that was absolutely invaluable to the sector, and I think where possible the sector businesses absolutely made full use of what was on offer. And I think in the evidence we've presented at different times how different businesses have benefited from the various grants that were on offer, furlough, business rates relief, all were, really, really important to keeping an awful lot of businesses going during a difficult time.
And that support, was that support directed at the industry specifically or businesses generally?
Well, there was a suite of generic support, both from the UK government and in Scotland, but particularly the Close Contact Services Fund that came in the third wave. So it came when the Omicron variant showed itself, was really useful because it was targeted, it was specific to the sector, it was made available relatively quickly, and at that point there was support from the UK government that was starting to fall away. So at that point it became a really helpful and really useful intervention, and again I think helped keep a number of or certainly a number of businesses going when they would otherwise have been really struggling at that particular moment in time.
Thank you. Could we please have on screen answer 4 on page 3? Thank you. In the Relay response, Ms Robson, it indicates the financial support from the Scottish Government wasn't necessarily proactively offered, but came after us lobbying, providing evidence of the challenging business environment and making a case for support. Could you tell us what that lobbying involved?
Yeah, there was definitely, as I mentioned, we're always really careful to provide evidence to government, to not just come with case studies, but show what's really happening. So that's why our quarterly survey was really important throughout the period of the three lockdowns and the restrictions, because we wanted to make sure that we were always showing what businesses were thinking of feeling, what they were planning, what was actually happening on the ground. So throughout that period, and I think I've outlined some of the correspondence we had with the Scottish Government, to every time we ran a survey, we were very careful to make sure that where we could, we pointed out what the trends were in Scotland, so that they could use that information to inform their policy making, essentially.
Thank you. And before that lobbying, and you've indicated, slightly caveated, but it wasn't necessarily proactively offered. Before you undertook that lobbying, do you feel that the Scottish Government was taking into account the industry?
I think they were definitely listening. I mean, I think it was definitely a journey. We had initial contact at the very start of the process with one, I think it was the Economic Development team, and definitely in terms of their level of knowledge of the sector. I mean, they didn't have any technical expertise necessarily, and so that's something that I think over time definitely improved. As we worked together, as they came to us for advice, and as we gave our insights into how the sector works, I think over time the guidance and the targeted nature of the guidance improved.
Do you feel therefore that you were educating the Scottish Government at the time?
I think so. I mean, most. You perhaps wouldn't expect technical expertise within the Scottish Government if individuals had not worked in a particular sector before. So I think because of that, it became really important that they were open-minded and they were open to us feeding in, and they were open to that partnership approach. And I think over time, learned a lot more about the sector, and we worked together quite well. But I think at the beginning there was a bit of catch up to be done, and we did. Certainly, colleagues spent a lot of time in terms of the early drafts of guidance, feeding in our expertise, and it was heavily sort of coming from the sector, whereas over time it became a bit more of a collaboration.
Thank you. And just picking up on that, if we could have answer 3 on screen. I think we might be going the wrong way. On page 2. Thank you. And just at the bottom there, you've said lobbied the government in collaboration with other sector organisations for earlier reopening of salons, relaxation of the guidelines, and for targeted financial support to the sector in form of business rates relief and grant support. Mm-hmm. Is that the kind of areas where you were talking to government to try and, I think my word, educate them?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there was a difference, obviously, between the earlier opening in England and some of the other parts of the UK versus Scotland, and we were in touch with them about the guidelines and, as you say, also financial support. So, the written correspondence we had with the Scottish Government and some of the meetings we had with the retail team dealt with those themes essentially.
Did you do anything specifically to help politicians understand the sector?
We did when it became possible. There were meetings at various points with the lead minister, the public finance minister, both with us and with other sector organisations. And when it became possible, we did organise salon visits just to for MSPs and also Scottish MPs based in Westminster to show them directly how businesses were operating, the impact of lockdowns and restrictions, and just how many of them operate previously, operate very well functioning sort of hygiene protocols and health and safety protocols, which are sort of very well developed within industry, which is all people focused and looking to look after your clients in the best possible way.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions now about guidance, if I may, that was provided to the industry. You mentioned the increase in members over the pandemic, and I think you mentioned that people looking for assistance in terms of the guidance. Did the Federation provide that assistance to its members over the pandemic?
Yes, we did. We obviously worked very closely with the Scottish Government to shape their guidelines. I mean, colleagues sort of looked at drafts, provided advice, and helped shape their the advice they were giving to business. But as I mentioned, because we are very mindful of the fact that our audience is sort of strongly neurodiverse, we were always finding ways to make that guidance more accessible, and we did it through straightforward Q&As, because our membership team were taking regular phone calls from the membership with their sort of concerns and queries, and we used those questions, those everyday questions, to put together FAQs and just make the information a little bit more accessible, take out the government speak, and try and communicate in a really direct way as possible.
You've obviously mentioned the contacting your neurodiverse members, and you've spoken about how you might alter your written content. Was there any other content that the Federation produced to assist its members?
We produced, alongside the government guidelines that we helped shape, we produced a suite of resources, actually, and we had a hub on the website, a coronavirus hub, where there was all sorts of resources from. We had Q&As about the different rules and restrictions across the nations, so not just Scotland, but in Northern Ireland, Wales and England as well. So it was clear to members, how the rules varied and how the restrictions varied. We had various blogs and more detailed information about supporting your staff, about mental health, and also a work safely guidance. So all the different rules around, social distancing. How can you structure your salon in a way that you're respecting the rules around social distancing, thinking about health and safety protocols, thinking about how you perhaps take card payments rather than dealing with cash, and how you manage people coming in the salon to make sure that you don't have people crowded around the reception, and you're managing the flow of people into your business. So all those different aspects to running a business within the COVID environment, within those restrictions, were available on the website and available on the hub. And I think importantly as well, our membership team, because it's a sector that loves to talk and loves to talk to people. So written advice only goes so far, and having someone at the end of the phone to share experiences and seek advice from was really invaluable. And the team won. I came to this later in the process, but the team won multiple awards. So for the support that they provided during COVID. So fantastic work from them.
Thank you. And you've provided some additional comments on this in the Rule 8 response. We could have the bottom of page 4, please. And you've indicated within that, with a high proportion of neurodiverse individuals, were particularly interested in creating content which was as accessible as possible, which you've just alluded to. You also mentioned there visual or video-based content. Can you tell his lordship anything about that?
Yes, so we have a social media team, and obviously when you're working in a salon or barbershop business, you're not in front of a laptop or a computer screen all day. You've got a mobile phone, and you're on social media. So a lot of the content we produce is mobile friendly, and it's also appropriate to social media. So it might be resources that we adapt to be more visual with short bullet points, or video based where we offer webinars. I mean, certainly during COVID we ran a number of Instagram live sessions where thousands of people logged on to get the latest on the guidelines and the latest advice. So the video based and webinar content was really popular as well.
Thank you. You've mentioned obviously the sector is larger than just the membership of the Federation. Some people joined and obviously have left since. Are there other groups that represent health and beauty that you worked with over the pandemic?
Yes, we did. We were really conscious that we wanted to provide consistency and advice across different organisations. So we worked particularly through a collaboration of organisations called the Beauty Industry Group. So that included the British Beauty Council and also BABTAC, who are the British Association of Beauty Therapists, amongst others. But it was really important to, because we're a combination of small organisations in terms of staff, that it was important that we came together to collaborate, share expertise, and make sure that both the messages we were putting to government were consistent, but also that the advice and guidance that we were providing to the sector were consistent in their messaging as well.
Thank you. And that group's operating across the whole of the UK, is that correct?
Beauty Industry Group is, yes, exactly, yeah.
Thank you. And does that mean, it's probably self-evident, but does that mean that that group were liaising, and indeed we know the Federation operates across the whole UK, but liaising with more than just the Scottish Government?
Yes, we had conversations with, the group would meet, say, every couple of months, or when was needed to look at guidance and talk about the relationship with government. And we were dealing with UK government, but also the Scottish government, the Welsh government, and also the Northern Ireland executive as well. So there were 4 different sets of conversations going on about 4 different sets of guidance.
And did you find that those conversations were reflective of each other?
Well, it was clear that of course each of nation had their their own approach and their own policy making and their own sort of set of public health information. But we're a small organisation with a team of 15 people. Other organisations in the sector are equally, small. So we don't have a lot of resources. And we were finding, and colleagues were finding, that we were looking at 4 different sets of guidance, coming out of one meeting, going into another, and repeating the same, the same advice and suggestions, when it would have been brilliant if the officials from the individual governments would have collaborated a bit more and spoken to each other and learnt from each other. So I think if this ever happens again and going forward, that would be something that would be really valuable from our point of view, as if different governments could talk to each other and learn from each other a bit more.
Thank you. Having had those multiple conversations with the different nations, you're probably uniquely placed to comment upon this. How did you find the different approaches between the 4 nations, or indeed between Scotland and the other nations?
I guess there was a difference in the England conversations. Perhaps it's because there's more resources in the UK government, but there was a speed at a UK level that wasn't happening in some of the other nations. So say, for example, the Prime Minister would make an announcement about the latest set of restrictions or changes to those restrictions, and then we would, as a sector, meet very soon after that, perhaps that evening or the following day, to discuss, how we were going to respond. And then pretty soon after that, guidance would emerge. The risk for us was that announcements would be made publicly, and then we didn't have the information to provide to our membership and to the wider sector. And it's fine when you can say, we're talking to the government, it's coming, please be patient, we'll provide it as soon as we're able to do that. But it felt like that process was slightly slower in Scotland. So rather than us being able to have those conversations straight away and feed in, it felt that there was a bit of a, maybe perhaps a 2 or 3 day delay before we could have those conversations and feed into the latest version of the guidance. And it might have been resourcing related. I'm not sure.
Thank you. And did you feel that the approach in terms of the restrictions and the levels of restriction, I suppose, was appropriate for your industry?
I'd certainly say that there was a lot of concern from businesses in Scotland when they saw what was happening in England, and they saw that reopening was happening earlier, but also that restrictions were being lifted sooner, that there was a concern that it would be a lot more challenging to recover. And it's a sector still in recovery, frankly, when you look at the levels of debt. We've been asking, as I say, through our quarterly survey, and you've still got, at this point, half of the sector in debt, and many of them saying it's going to take between 2 and 5 years to clear. We're not. It's still still a sector in recovery, essentially.
You're mentioning there that Scottish business is looking at what's happening south of the border. Do I take it from that they felt it was more restrictive north of the border?
Yes, I think, they did, definitely. I mean, and also that in Scotland, the masks and mask wearing within the business were kept for longer. So even though your business is open, able to open, you're operating restrictions, probably because of social distancing, so your capacity to generate revenue is reduced. But also I think there was a lot of concern around the fact that you're creating a sense of, in a business where you're all about people and you're all about the client experience and you want people to feel relaxed and comfortable in a certain environment, to come into that environment and everybody's wearing masks is already deterring you from probably even getting an appointment in. So I think that certainly was something that did have an impact in Scotland, and it was very clear when I did the analysis around the quarterly survey results, and as I said, that we got very strong sample sizes, so it was very easy to compare what was happening in Scotland with some of the other nations. It was very clear that the recovery in Scotland was slower than in England, and I could see that across different indicators, across looking at levels of business activity, looking at your plans for the future, looking at business intentions to grow. There were multiple indicators in Scotland that were saying that the outlook of those businesses and their planning was sort of more negative than in England and also in some of the other nations as well.
Thank you. Did the Federation have any insight into why a different approach was taken north of the border?
Well, I think it was a different set of a different government and a different set of public health considerations, and obviously we respect each of the governments had across the nations had a very difficult set of decisions to make. But I can just point out to you that the impact in Scotland had an economic impact on our sector and probably many others as well.
In the Rule 8 response, you make the observation that early guidelines in particular were very cautious and restrictive, and you indicate that reflected the very high level of uncertainty about the virus at the time. And I appreciate you've obviously indicated there that these decisions were being taken on the basis of information. With the benefit of hindsight, do you feel that those approaches were too cautious or too restrictive?
I understand at the start of the process, so in 2020 and at the very start of the pandemic, there was obviously a lot of uncertainty about the virus and how it was going to spread, and we do understand that so the reasons for those the reasons for the slightly more restrictive and cautious approach, but as I say, it was slightly different from England and some of the other nations as well. So it definitely had, that approach definitely had an impact. And I feel that from speaking to colleagues, I think we were listened to, and I think we had, lots of opportunities to speak to the Scottish Government, but there were moments when we felt like we were communicating, but that our views weren't taken on board. And I think that happened when there were times when hair businesses, for example, were allowed to open first, but then beauty businesses were allowed to reopen after. But then it's difficult because there are a lot of businesses that run combined services. So you've got hair and beauty businesses, and hair businesses offering a range of different treatments. And I think there were moments when that caused the decision-making caused concern within the sector that it wasn't fair at that point, because you've got some businesses allowed to be open and others not. So Yeah.
Was there any indication as to why that distinction was made?
Well, I think it was due to decision making at the time, thinking about perhaps what were essential businesses to reopen. But as I say, it's a sector that offers a huge amount in economic terms and to high streets, but also to well-being. So, some might see the beauty treatment side of it as being, frivolous isn't perhaps the right word, but, the sector's offering an awful lot in terms of, mental health support in various different ways, both through, informal counselling, and some practitioners go on to achieve more formal qualifications, mental health support, cancer care, massage, treatment for all, through alternative and holistic therapies. There's a much broader application of the sector. So I think there was a frustration that we were sort of seen as, a bit frivolous, which was a bit annoying for many.
Was there any discussion between you and them to perhaps explain why it wasn't frivolous for exactly the sort of reasons you enunciated?
With the government, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that formed part of the conversation. Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Flashmore. You'd mentioned that you wouldn't have necessarily expected technical expertise within government in respect of your industry, but when thinking about that kind of decision making, do you feel that was understood, that position, in terms of you've just indicated, His Lordship, the kinds of information that you were giving to government? Do you feel that they understood the consequences that you were telling them?
Sorry, what was the first part in terms of?
I harked back to the fact that you said earlier that you didn't necessarily expect government to have technical expertise within government, and that's why you were educating them to a certain extent on these matters. But do you feel, having had those conversations, that they were understanding that? And do you feel that maybe they should have had technical expertise to understand that better?
Though I think in the early days, from conversations with colleagues, when they were looking at guidance and giving advice, I think they were contributing an awful lot, so filling gaps in knowledge, essentially. And I think that knowledge from within the Scottish Government improved over time. Sorry, I don't think I fully answered your question. But
well, I suppose what I'm asking is, do you feel that the decisions the government were taking were implementing matters, taking account of that new knowledge?
I think they were definitely listening, yes. But I think there were moments of frustration, like the moment when reopening happened for some businesses and not others, that there was a feeling that perhaps all of the information wasn't getting through. And I understand that the government has a set of information about the virus and public health that we obviously didn't have access to. But I can only express that there was at moments there was a lot of frustration within the sector about decisions that were made, both in terms of reopening and continuing restrictions longer than in other parts of the UK.
Thank you. We've talked about the information going into government. We've talked about the Federation providing information to its members on the basis of information coming out of government. I wonder if I could ask you some questions about that information coming out of government. Are you able to tell us anything about the quality of that information?
Well, the guidelines that came from the Scottish Government, I think there was a broad understanding that they were quite good. I mean, obviously, as I said, in the early days, we had a significant input into those guidelines. So we felt like we'd had the opportunity to shape them, and we also encouraged the Scottish Government to make advice a little bit more accessible to our audience. So rather than providing reams of prose, come up with straightforward checklists where a business could just, go through a page or two and have various prompts that made them think about, have I implemented this in my business? Have I thought about social distancing? Have I thought about the masks? And made sure that they'd taken on board each aspect that they needed to, but in a straightforward way. And that certainly, there was a shift towards providing guidance and resources that are a little bit more accessible as time went on.
And do you feel that you helped government in that way understand the audience that they were facing?
I think so, yes, yeah.
Could we have a look at page 9 of your response and the answer to 12, please? And the third bullet there, Ms Robson, says, simplified. We're talking about here, in addition to comments about the guidance, the main issues we would flag. And the third bullet there says simplified public communications. We would also like to see even more simple communications to the public in order that they are clear on current measures. Some businesses reported there was a tendency for customers and clients with later restrictions to revert to old lockdown measures and be more risk averse and not go out because of confusion about what the rules were, having a negative impact on business. Is that really what you're saying before in terms of simplifying so people could understand it?
Yeah, I think we've talked about the communications to the sector, but I think there's a broader point about communications to the public, and certainly feedback from sector businesses, particularly getting towards the sort of second and third lockdown, was the fact that there was, towards the later stages, there was just confusion about what the rules actually were. And then because of that, a tendency to just be over-cautious and a little bit more cautious than actually the rules at the time were saying, which meant that it was slower to get a lot of sector businesses off the ground. You're open, but you've got fewer clients coming in the door, and just because they're thinking, I'm not sure what the rules are now, but I'm just going to stay at home anyway because I feel more comfortable about doing that.
So just to be clear there, when you're saying stay at home, so when you're talking about people being risk averse, you're not talking about the businesses, you're talking about the customers being more risk averse.
Yeah. I mean, that was some feedback that I got from sector businesses in Scotland, that they felt that their client base wasn't returning as quickly. I mean, of course, after reopening, there was that burst of activity and a lot of people putting in appointments. But then prior to COVID, say, with hair appointments, people would be going sort of between every 4 and 6 weeks. And then that became sort of between 9 and 12 weeks because people were staying away for that little bit longer, which it then becomes even more challenging to make a viable business because your clients aren't coming in quite as frequently as they were before.
And it may be implicit from what you've just said. Do you think that had an impact on businesses when they reopened?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
One of the benefits of the inquiry is that we're able to look at everything retrospectively. This isn't a test of what the government did as much as what it could do in the future, and we're obviously looking forward to lessons that might be learned. With the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that you feel, or I should say the Federation feels, that the government should be learning for the future?
I think certainly to think more about we look at the 4 harms framework, think more about the impact on the mental health of the staff and the owner and the rest of society, and also the economic impact as well. And I think if that had been balanced against transmission rates and public health, I think it might have given a broader picture.
Thank you. And we've talked quite a lot about restrictions, and we've talked a lot about timing of guidance and the like. Is there anything in that regard that the government might consider?
I think in the future there were moments when we had very good relationships with some of the officials. I think we felt that ministers were relatively accessible when we needed them, and responsive to some of the data we were giving. But I think going forward, it'd be great if in the future the individual administrations could work together and learn from each other in a way that I don't think really happened, and think more about and work with us to provide the best and most accessible guidance for our audience.
Thank you. That was all the specific questions that I have for you, Ms. Robson. I'm going to give you an opportunity in a moment to raise with His Lordship if there is anything else that you particularly think that His Lordship should hear from the Federation. I just remind you, we obviously have your Relate response and your other documentation. That will all be taken into account, but this is really your opportunity. If there is anything that His Lordship should hear, please let him know.
Well, I think you've been very thorough. We're really pleased to have the opportunity to come and speak on behalf of the sector. It's a very proud and passionate sector, and one that's still, as I mentioned, still in recovery. And I think we'll need further targeted support to survive and thrive into the future. Very pleased to give the sector a voice today. So thank you very much for inviting us in.
Thank you. My Lord, unless you have anything further.
No, I've got nothing to ask. Thank you very much, Ms. Robson. I'm very grateful for your time in coming and your assistance.
Good.
Right, 1:45. Mr. Stephen at that stage, I think, you're having a break. All right for some.
All rise.